be our heart's desire this morning as we've come together. We welcome you with praise for how you have revealed yourself to us, Almighty God of love. Be welcome in this place. May every heart adore this morning. May every soul awake as we wait upon you this morning. In the precious name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Please have a seat.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us. We're especially glad to welcome our guests. You can let us know you're here today by filling out the blue connection card, which is in your worship folder, or on the Trinity app. We would love to know what is going on in your life, and we're honored to be able to pray for you. Later on in the service, you can drop that card in the offering basket, or if you're a guest, you can take it to our guest services center in the lobby. We've got a lot of great things happening here at Trinity. Here is some of the highlights.
Here at Trinity, we are passionate about adoption and foster care. That's one way we reverberate in our valley. All of us have some role to play in supporting kids and families. If you are interested in finding out how you can help support those involved in foster care in our valley, then join us Monday, May 8th at 6:30 p.m. for dessert and hear about the needs of our local DCFS and foster families, or learn more about what fostering looks like. Find out how these things ultimately impact the children in foster care in our valley. There are lots of ways to support foster children without being a foster parent yourself. See you tomorrow evening.
Are you ready to have a groovy summer? At Trinity, we're making plans to celebrate the Summer of Love. This is our chance to show love to our friends, our faith family, and our community. We're planning lots of great events this summer. Events that will help you connect with your faith family, events that will help us reach our community, and we'll have ways to equip you to make a difference with your own friends and neighbors. We'll have more details coming soon, but the Summer of Love kicks off with a fun way to celebrate the longest day of the year on June 20th.
If you've been around Trinity for a little while, I want to let you know about a great next step for you. Maybe you are ready to make Trinity your church by becoming a member. Then Engage is for you. Or maybe you're just not there yet and you want to know a little bit more about Trinity. Then come to Engage. Engage is a one-time class that will help you learn who we are, how you fit, and where to go from here. Engage is happening tomorrow evening, so if you would like to attend, this is your last chance to sign up. Just mark the back of your connection card.
That's all of our announcements today. If you are a guest, don't forget to stop by our guest services center in the lobby to get your free gift. It is just our way to say that we're glad you joined us today. And if you want to get connected with anything that is happening here at Trinity, download the Trinity app or visit us online. Enjoy the rest of the morning.
Good morning. It's good to be able to worship with you this morning. I appreciate Jonathan, our musicians, and the way that they lead us in connecting with God in a meaningful way every Sunday. We're really thankful for them, and just singing this morning. You know, you don't need. It doesn't take It only takes a moment to remind you of how dependent you really are on God. It doesn't take a year to learn that lesson. It doesn't take a week or a day. You can be reminded, we can be reminded of our dependence in just one split second. And so it's good to be mindful of that all the time, that God alone is worthy, and He is our heart's desire. That is a right way for us to reconnect with God. And so good to be able to do that with you this morning. I know that Thad Anderson, Pastor Thad, his family was reminded in just a moment this week of how dependent they are on God. And I know many of you have been praying for Thad. So he's our student ministries pastor and just had some crazy things happen this week, almost a year anniversary to them happening last year, only a little more significant in some ways this year, I think, with some other complications. So he spent the night in ICU and is home now and doing fine. You would look at him and you wouldn't think there's anything going on, but there's some things that they're working on. So thanks for praying for Thad and his family. They're being well taken care of right now, but you could keep them in your prayers. Well, the Chinese, we've said this before, we've said it recently, that the Chinese blessing / curse, may you live in interesting times. We've talked a little bit about that lately. One of the things that I think is interesting about the age that we live in today is that we live in a time that is both a time of skepticism and enthusiasm at the same time. You know, people about the very same thing, skepticism and enthusiasm. A good illustration of that took place just last week on social media. And some of you social media types, maybe you heard about this. A women's swimsuit company wanted to run a promotion for their women's swimsuit line for the summer, and so they started a social media promotion, and they started a promotion on Instagram and on Twitter. Same promotion, and basically it was this. They would give a $65 voucher to anyone who would retweet a picture of this red swimsuit that they were trying to promote. So part of the picture's on your left. They were going to, if you just promote this, if you repost this picture and then hashtag the company, which is the Sunny Clothing Company, if you'd hashtag them, then they would give you a $65 gift certificate to purchase your own red swimsuit. So Instagram people, they saw this and they thought, oh, this is wonderful, you know, and they said, it's a beautiful picture and a beautiful pool and a beautiful swimsuit, and I want to share this with my friends, and I'll share this with my friends, and they'll love it, and they'll appreciate it, and they'll get a $65, maybe they could repost it too, and I'll get a $65 voucher, and they can get a $65 voucher, and then the Sunny Clothing Company will get their promotion, will be well received, and everyone will be just happy. And that's Instagram. And so it started going viral on Instagram. Well, it was also promoted on Twitter. And if you know anything about Twitter people, they're just not as nice as Instagram people. All right? Twitter people are snarky and sarcastic, and so they got on Twitter and they started making their own thing out of this campaign. They started making fun of it, saying all kinds of snarky things, like this tweet right here. It says, "Girls this summer pulling up to the pool with their free Sunny Company clothing swimsuit," you know? And so that's how Twitter responded to this promotion. And the other funny part about it is that the company started this going way more viral than they thought, and they started to panic about how many $65 vouchers they're going to end up giving away. So they put a cap on it, you know, stop, and everyone had a lot of fun with that. Well, I think it's funny that one thing can get such a different reaction from different kinds of people, and it makes me think about the series that we're in these 4 weeks. We're in week 3 of a 4-week study called Yeah, But, for people who like Jesus but still have questions. Because there are people who love Jesus and they love following Jesus and they don't have any real issues with it, and they're they'd fall in the enthusiastic category. And then there are people who fall into what we'll call the skeptical category, and they may even like Jesus, but they feel like he comes with so much baggage that they just can't get behind the whole thing. They may like Jesus, but they say, well, yeah, I like Jesus, but what about the church? I like Jesus, but what about the Bible? We talked about those previous Sundays. And some people are like, I like Jesus, but what about being a modern person? You know, the world we live in, it's a world of science and technology, and how can you be a thinking modern person and live in the scientific age and know what I know about the world and still believe Jesus? That's a legitimate question for a lot of people. It's definitely what a lot of people think today. They see believe that following Jesus and being a Christian is not possible for anyone who appreciates science, anyone who appreciates learning. They see Christianity as incompatible with science because it involves believing things that you can't replicate in a test tube. You can't reproduce them in a laboratory. You can't, like the existence of God or that man has a soul. You can't reproduce that in a laboratory. It involves believing things that can't be proven, and it involves believing things that you just don't see happen in the natural world. Miracles that can't be replicated, things that are like, the world doesn't work that way. That's magical thinking. And really, the record of Jesus is full of miracles. So you really can't really like Jesus and not accept the fact that there are miracles, because Jesus, his own life record is full of him performing miracles, as well as the fact that there are certain pockets of time in the history of the Bible. As you read the Bible, there's certain pockets of time where miracles occurred. Jesus' life is certainly one of those. Lots of miracles where he performed miracles of healing and power over the natural world, and of course his own resurrection from the dead. And so people think, those things, if you know science, those things don't happen. And so because following Jesus involves accepting things accepting these things you can't reproduce in a laboratory, or things that just seem to break the laws of the natural world, for some people it's just too much to swallow. If it can't be proven in a test tube, if it's not explainable by natural causes, then I just can't believe it. Why? Because faith is different than science. One of those is based in reality and hard facts, and one of those is based in fantasy and imagination. So you can't really follow Jesus and at the same time be a modern thinking person. That's what a lot of people think. And there's a very strong perception in our culture, and I'm going to call it a narrative. I think that's actually more accurate. There's a very strong narrative in our culture that the more educated you become, the farther you're going to get from any of this faith stuff, any kind of religion. That's the narrative, that the more educated you become, the less religious you'll be. And that's pretty much an unquestioned assumption in our culture. The more religious you are, the less educated you are. The more educated you are, the less religious you are. Those things have to go. They have to exist in inverse relationship to each other. That's the narrative. That's why the news last week was so interesting, because NPR reported on a research project just finished by the Pew Research Center. And NPR reported on this story, and you can hear the pain in their voice as they reported this story. And here's what they found. I'm going to read from that story to you here in just a second, and I'll just read it to you. A study released by the Pew Research Center this week on the relation in the United States between religiosity and educational attainment, at first glance appears to support the secularization thesis. Secularization thesis: the more educated you become, the more secular you become, the less you believe in religious life. And here's what they found. College graduates are less likely to say they believe in God with absolute certainty. They are less likely to say that religion is important in their lives. They are less likely to pray regularly, and they're more likely than others to identify themselves as atheists and agnostics, college graduates. So, supports the narrative. Supports the narrative. The more educated you become, the less religious you become. This is the story continues. A closer look at the data, however, offers a more nuanced picture. While highly educated Jews tend to be less observant than less educated Jews, the relationship between education and religiosity is weaker among those Americans with a strong Christian identity. Here's the headline. Yes, the more religious you become, or the more educated you become, the less religious you become, unless you're a Christian. With Christians, here's the quote, highly educated Christian adherents are just as religious, and in some cases more religious, than their fellow members who might have less education. All right, the takeaway is that this narrative, the more educated you become, the less religious you become, holds for other faiths, but does not hold for Christianity. That Christians in America, there is not a correlation between more education and less belief in Jesus. In some cases, actually, the more educated a person becomes, the more strongly they identify with their Christian faith. That is not the narrative that is put out there on a regular basis. It's not what we've been led to believe. It's not what people would have us believe. So how could it be that you could be an educated Christian and still be a Jesus follower? How could that be possible, that you could take Jesus and learning both seriously? Because following Jesus requires believing things that you can't really replicate in the laboratory, and some things that you've never seen before and probably will never see in your lifetime. Miracles that just defy science. How can educated people believe these things? That's what we want to talk about this morning. First, I have to issue this disclaimer. So, there are people in this room right now, and there were people in first service, smarter than me by a long shot. Smarter than me, and who also know a lot more about science than I do. Science is not my field of study. I've always loved science. I've always appreciated science. I have tried to read A Brief History of Time 3 times. I've quit halfway through each time. So I have my limitations. Even though I appreciate science, I have my limitations. It's not so much that I didn't choose a career in physics, it's that physics didn't choose me. Okay? So, that being said, I have done some homework on this and some reading, and I'm pleased to be able to share some of the things I've learned with you. I want to talk about 2 big things, and then a bonus question. First, I want to talk about the compatibility between science and Christianity. Second thing I want to talk about is do you have to believe unscientific things to be a Christian? So first, the relationship between science and Christianity. Second, do you have to believe unscientific things to be a Christian? And then a bonus question at the end. So first, we're going to talk about the compatibility issue. Now, there are different views on the compatibility between Christianity and science. That doesn't come as a surprise. Different views. And these views can exist on a spectrum. Someone in the 1960s kind of put this together. And so it's kind of helpful to think about this spectrum of views on the relationship between Christianity and science that go from conflict all the way to independence. Conflict, then dialogue, and then integration, and then independence. And that there are different people who have different postures on this spectrum towards the relationship between Christianity and science. But a lot of people are stuck on the first one, conflict. And if we're talking about narratives, one of the narratives in our culture is that science and Christianity are in conflict with each other. They're in conflict. They're not compatible. And it's a strong narrative. And there are people who want our culture to accept this narrative that science and Christianity are at loggerheads. There's a natural conflict between them. And it's interesting, some of the reading that I've done just this week, has it's taught me some things I didn't know about the history of the relationship between Christianity and science. And there are some things that are perpetuated, really, that you may believe about the relationship between Christianity and science, that you may have even been taught in school, that are actually urban myths. And the easiest one to identify is the one about Christopher Columbus. So I'll tell you what I was taught about Christopher Columbus. I asked my family, and they were, I did a little small sample research at my house last night, and everyone with the last name Henderson at my house, I sampled them and asked them what they'd been taught. So what I was taught about Christopher Columbus is that Christopher Columbus was a brave man because he believed the world was round at a time when everybody believed the earth was flat. Now, I don't know if that's what you were taught, but that's what I was taught. Christopher Columbus believed the earth was round. Everyone else thought the earth was flat. He said, no, it's round. And he challenged the ignorant people around him. And he actually, if you read a little bit about that, you'll read that, he met with this church council, and this council said, you're a heretic, the earth is flat, and he said, no, it's round, and I'm going to prove it. And he had to fight the ignorance of his day. And if you uncover that narrative a little bit, the ignorance of his day was fed by the church, the medieval church of the 1400s. And so they thought the earth was flat, and he said it's round, and thanks to Columbus, he proved that the world is actually round and overcame the ignorance of the day. So, that's not how it happened. I don't know. I'm not going to have you raise your hands and say, that's what I thought happened. But that's what I thought happened. That's what I was taught. But if you do just a little bit of reading, that's not true. That everyone, not everyone, not every peasant necessarily, but it was common that day. People knew the world was round. People had known the world was round for a long time. There weren't people who were telling Columbus the earth was flat. They understood the world was round. Well, how in the world did I learn as a kid going to school that Columbus thought the world was round and everyone else thought the world was flat? How did I learn that? If you do a little bit of reading on this subject, it's pretty interesting, and it's going to sound like fake news to you if you've been taught this. And I'll share some resources with you if you want to do further reading. But in the late 1800s, there were a couple of influential men who wrote books. They wanted to feed this conflict narrative between Christianity and science. Why did they want to do that? Because evolution as a theory was just beginning to take a strong foothold, kind of shaking up worldviews. Darwin wrote Origin of Species in 1838 or 36 or something like that, right? And then the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s. And between that period of time, this growing debate about the origins of the universe and the world and mankind. And so there were a couple people who wrote significant works that added fuel to this narrative that Christianity and science are actually in conflict. And one of these guys embellished this Columbus story and other stories like it to feed this false narrative that Christianity and science are in conflict with each other. And if that sounds like fake news, then read what I've been reading. Read Tim Keller. I've got some resources for you. I'll share them at the end. Read Rodney Stark. He's got 80 pages on it in a chapter in one of his books. 80 pages with 273 footnotes. He's a prof from UW, and now he's at Baylor. And he's written on this, and it's exactly what he says, that there are some people who had agendas. They wanted to fuel this conflict narrative between Christianity and science. I still wasn't sure I bought it because I didn't, science is not my field of study. And so I did some more reading and came across an essay written by Stephen Jay Gould. Those of you who study creation, evolution kinds of debates, you know the name Stephen Gould. He's no friend of Christianity. But he has an essay on how bogus this story is that everybody thought the earth was flat in Columbus's day. And he actually comes to the defense of the church and says none of that ever happened. Columbus didn't fight the church to convince them that the world, he said none of that happened. And he actually goes into this discussion of how these men whom he has admired, whose writings he has owned, how they really were they were dishonest in their representation of the history of Christianity and science. And when I read Stephen Gould talking about that, then I decided, okay, I don't think it's fake news. I think this is what really happened. You can read for it on your own. There are Christians too, let me say this. There are Christians too who accept this conflict narrative and think that the Bible and Christianity are in conflict. And that's their posture on this subject. The true relationship between science and Christianity is not one of conflict. It's further down the spectrum. It's, I think, closer to one of integration. Integration says that all truth is God's truth. All truth is God's truth, and if we're discovering actual truth, all of it's going to fit together. You don't always know how it fits together. Scientists know certain things are true, and they can't tell you how they fit together. So it's possible to know certain things are true and not exactly know how to fit together, but if you knew, you would know how they fit together. All truth is God's truth. It ultimately fits together, and Christianity and science fit together. As a matter of fact, not only do they fit together, but it is the Christian worldview that produced science in the first place. Now, let me make a point. Rodney Stark makes this point in his book. He says that a lot of cultures have developed technology. All right, technology is what works, and you determine what works through trial and error. Let me try this. So that didn't work so great. Let me try this. Oh, that worked a lot better. We're going to keep doing it that way. And that lots of cultures have developed fairly high levels of technology. China developed gunpowder and the compass and paper. Rome developed the aqueduct and catapults. And other cultures have developed, metallurgy and architecture, and it's progressed. And all of these are great and helpful, but they're technology. Technology is about what works, and it's developed through trial and error. Science is not technology. It's something different. It's about why something works and how it works. It's about finding explanations. Now, some cultures had explanations for how their culture or how their technology worked, but they were kind of magical explanations, or they were never tested explanations, And so science is about testing those explanations. Here's why I think this happens. And they test it, and they experiment, and they replicate it. These cultures had technology, but they didn't have science. They weren't trying to find out why. Only one culture tried finding out why. That was the culture that developed within a Christian worldview. A Christian worldview believes in a rational, orderly God who created a rational, orderly world that operates according to rational, orderly principles, and discovering those principles is a worthy endeavor, because by discovering those principles, you learn about God Himself. By discovering the world He made, you can learn about God. They accepted the premise that we read about in Psalm 19 that says this: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. Their voice goes out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. That the world, the heavens, the universe declares the glory of God. It's this view of the world that led people to want to know more about the why, because it pointed to the who that's behind the why. And as they could learn the whys, they would learn about the who made them. I can't think of a better reason why Christians ought to love science than that it shows us, reveals to us more about God. Romans 1, this is Paul in Romans 1, he says something similar. The invisible things of God, you can't see God. The invisible things of God, since the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made. God's invisible, but He's created the world, and you can see certain things about the invisible God by looking at His visible creation. When you look at creation, you see that you can see God's wisdom, His creativity, His power, His beauty. And you can make certain inferences about what God is like just by looking at the world that we live in. That's how science was born. People wanted to understand the why because it would reveal something about the who behind the why. And so science was born. Historically, Christianity gave birth to science. In the words of Stark, he says this: Christians developed science because they believed it could be done and should be done. Now, you can read more on that subject. I'll give you some resources. Keller and Stark would be great places to start, but it boils down to this: there is no inherent necessary conflict between Christianity and science. It's actually just the opposite. Christianity is fertile soil for the pursuit of science. Well, what about this? So if there's no conflict, but still, all right, maybe there's no inherent conflict, but still, don't you have to believe some unscientific things in order to be a Christian, to be a Jesus follower? Don't you have to believe in God and angels and miracles and life after death and things like that? And aren't those things unscientific? Well, no, they're actually not unscientific. They're just outside the realm of science. There are certain truths that are not unscientific. They're just outside science's ability to know those things. There's a view of science, and we've grown up in this day and age. The view of science that says science is how we know everything about the world. Science will explain everything about the world. There is no such thing as truth outside the realm of science. There's no such thing as truth that can't be validated in a test tube. Now, we may not understand all of it. We may not be able to say we know how it all fits together. But if we could, all knowledge and all reality could be discovered by science. But what if there's a part of reality that just can't be measured by science? Science is only equipped to deal with the natural world. What if there's something that exists outside of the natural world? What if it exists outside our senses? By definition, if it exists outside our senses, we can't sense it. And science can't measure it. So does that mean it doesn't exist? No, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means we don't have the capacity to measure it. That's science. Science is only equipped to measure the natural world. God, your soul, life after death. Those things are not part of the natural world per se. So science is not equipped to deal with them. That doesn't mean they don't exist. That just means science can't measure them. There's a famous illustration that is helpful. Imagine a person they're drunk, they had a little bit too much, and it's night, time to go home, and so they're on their way to their car, they're walking down the street, on their way to the car at night, and they lose their car keys. So they lose their car keys on this dark street, and there's only one street light on the street, and it's down there. And so where do they go to look for their car keys? Well, they go look right under the light. Well, why are they looking under the light? Why don't they look somewhere else? Well, because the light is better here. Okay? Well, what if your car keys aren't here? Well, they have to be here because this is where I can see. Okay? See the problem with that? And that's science. Science only can search within a certain part of reality. Science only sees under the streetlight. And if something exists outside of the streetlight, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means it can't be seen. It doesn't mean it's not there. Just this week I heard, and again on NPR, an interview with a scientist, and I didn't get to listen to much of the interview, and I really just went straight to his book online. But his name is Marcus de Sautoy, I think is how they said it. I'm not sure the pronunciation, but he's a scientist, British, sounds like he's British. Name doesn't sound British, but he's a British guy, and he's written a book, and he's talking about what isn't, not just what is not known by science, but what cannot be known by science. And this new book is called The Great Unknown, and every chapter in the book is one other category of knowledge that cannot be addressed or cannot be fully known by science. And by the time you get to the end, he's an atheist, but by the time he gets to the end, he has to allow and acknowledge the fact that maybe God exists. God might exist because it's possible and it is not knowable by science. So what's my point? My point is that science can't explain everything. First of all, science can't explain everything under the streetlight itself. Everything under the streetlight, science can't explain all of it. There's a lot of unknown things that science has the capacity to know but hasn't yet determined. And so science doesn't know everything that science, there's still lots to learn there, let alone the fact that there's a whole street that exists outside of the spotlight, the street light, that science just cannot address. So, what that means is there's plenty of room. There's plenty of room for confidence in the person and teachings of Jesus. And there's plenty of room for confidence in the Bible that he thought so much of. There's plenty of room for confidence because there's a lot of knowledge that just cannot be addressed by science, let alone the things that are still unknown. So we don't need to be afraid. I guess this is a good time to say this. We don't need to be afraid of science. We don't need to be afraid of new learning. We don't need to be afraid of new discoveries because all truth is God's truth, and it will someday all fit together. So one last quick question. Now, this is your bonus question. So we've already said science and Christianity aren't in conflict. They're integrated. All truth is God's truth. We've said, well, don't I have to believe unscientific things to be a Christian? No, there are just certain things that science cannot address. And those are things that have to do with faith and who God is and how he's at work in the world. And those are things that sometimes science can't really touch on. And so there's not necessarily an inherent conflict. And then the last question, this is a bonus question, okay? So what about evolution? And I know you're happy that I brought that up. Do I have to take a certain position on evolution? if I believe that God exists, if I believe that God sent His Son, if I believe that God sent His Son to repair the mess I have made of things, the sin problem that I have, and that's why He sent His Son, and that by believing on Jesus, who rose from the dead, I can have my sins forgiven. And not only that, I know this because I accept the historical record. I treat the Bible seriously. I believe the Bible is an authoritative source of truth about God. If I believe those things, do I have to take a certain position on Genesis 1 and 2 and be able to say, this is exactly how God created the world? And my quick answer to that, courtesy of Tim Keller, is basically this. There are people who love Jesus and take the Bible very seriously, who believe that Jesus is the one God sent. He died in our place and rose again so that we could have a repaired relationship with God and live forever. That Jesus performed the miracles that He performed. That the Bible is an authoritative source of truth about God. But when they come to Genesis 1 and 2, they understand it differently. There are people who take a variety of positions about how God created the world and how God created humankind. And they all love Jesus, and they're wholehearted Jesus followers. So what that says to me is, yes, you can hold a different position on Genesis 1, Genesis 2, parts of Genesis 2 at least. And you can hold a different position and still take Jesus seriously and the Bible seriously. Because these are people who approach the Bible seriously. They take into account the rules we talked about last week, the rules of culture and context. And you take those and you look at Genesis 1 especially, and you're like, how does this apply? Some people see Genesis 1 as more of a historical narrative, and other people say, no, Genesis 1 portrays the features of ancient Near Eastern poetry, and so it should be interpreted in a more poetic fashion. And they integrate it all differently. But they all are Jesus followers. And when you talk about the main thing that the Bible teaches, the main thing we learn about God and the world, then you don't have to take a particular position on Genesis chapter 1 or 2. Now here's what I'd say. I am more comfortable the closer you get to a straightforward reading of Genesis 1. The closer you get to that in your way of integrating knowledge, then the more comfortable I am with that position. I'm very comfortable understanding that God made the world and that there's adaptations and natural selection and all that. Sure, I mean, that's common sense. I can almost see that happen in my backyard, you know. So I buy that. I can imagine that's part of how all these explanations can work together, all right? But what I am not comfortable with, I am less comfortable relying heavily on the expertise of people who insist on explaining the world just within the light of the street lamp. And I know that that's the way a lot of people approach this subject, non-Christians, secular scientists. They are totally committed to explaining it within the context of the streetlight. If you're totally committed to explaining reality within just that context, you're going to come up with some points of view that I can't agree with. And honestly, I'm not scientifically equipped to assess. So I am less comfortable relying heavily on people who insist on connecting all the dots just within the scope of the streetlight simply because that's the only light they have. That's why I'd like to advocate for Jesus followers who love science to go into the sciences and represent Jesus in the sciences. You'll be part of a long history of devout Jesus followers who have been leading scientists at the same time. Now, just this discussion should be enough to help you see that you don't have to accept a particular position on evolution, creation, to believe that God created the world. He created us. We have sinned. I believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Once you get to Adam and Eve, we're talking real people. And that's how sin came into the world. There are a few different people who think differently on that, but that's where I come down. And you don't have to take a particular position on whether God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh literal day, or whether He created over a period of time. Get into the deep end of the pool. Jesus is the one God sent. We are broken without him. Our only way to repair a relationship with God is by putting our confidence in him. And then that's what binds us together. So there you go. You can be a thinking modern person. You can be a science-loving person and still be a Jesus follower, because Christianity is not in conflict with science. It can be integrated with science. And actually, it gave birth to science. And it actually explains a lot of life that science can't even touch. And Jesus spoke to that part of life. And so we know we can, with confidence, look to Jesus and his teachings. And for those of us who sometimes wrestle with these things, here's kind of my main goal this morning was to equip all of us with some helpful information that probably we wonder from time to time, but especially to equip the person who wrestles with these kinds of things. If you wrestle with these kinds of things, here's where I hope I at least got you to this point. There are reasonable discussions on this subject from intelligent people who understand the issues, and that there's some dialogue that is possible and explanations that are reasonable. Doesn't mean it solves all your problems this morning, but I hope it at least helps you understand that there are maybe some parts of this discussion that you've not been exposed to before, and maybe there is more reason than you might have thought to accept the fact that Jesus is exactly who he said he is, the one that God sent to give us salvation and eternal life. I'm going to come back in a minute and share my resources with you, but right now I'd just like to pray. God, we are thankful this morning that we have truth, that you've revealed yourself. We believe you have revealed yourself in the world, that there are certain things just anyone can know about you, that you're wise and powerful and creative. And then by studying your creation, we can learn other things about you, your majesty and your glory and some of the extent of your wisdom. But we also know that you've revealed yourself more specifically through the Bible that tells us what you're really like, and through your Son, Jesus. And we live in a world that doesn't really know how to tie these two things together. And so my prayer is that you will help us to see that all truth is your truth, and that you will help us as we continue to follow you in a culture that tries to explain everything under the streetlight, and that we'll be able to understand more of how these things fit together because of this conversation today. And that as a result of that, we'll be able to represent you well. We'll be stronger in our own faith. And I pray for the person here this morning who might be specifically wrestling with these kinds of things, that you'll at least show him or her that explanations are possible, and that there are reasonable ways to think about these things that maybe they've just never considered before. And that consideration of these things would ultimately lead them to confidence in Jesus. And that's my prayer. And I ask it through Jesus. Amen.
Well, we're going to turn a corner and start to wrap up our time together this morning. So I'd like to bring our attention to your worship folder. We began by mentioning some events that are occurring tomorrow night, both the foster care information night and the Engage, both of which are tomorrow night. So if that's something, either of those sound like something that you would like to participate in, you can either plan on attending that, or you can indicate your interest on your blue card one final time. Also in the bulletin, something we try to remain transparent on is the state of giving. And we have, all year long, we have given sacrificially and made some significant investment in various ministries and aspects of the community. And so you'll notice here on the margin the updated up to the end of April giving, and we're just 2% behind. But if you 2% looks like a small number, but 2% of a large number is still a large number. So we want to continue to finish strong as we near the end of our fiscal year. Finally, just one more plug here for the connection card This is an opportunity again to mention any comments on the back, any interest that you have in the events coming up, and also just let us know that you're here. If you're a guest in particular, we'd like to know you're here and to remind you that on the guest services table right outside in the foyer is a gift that we'd like for you to take if this is one of your first times here with us. So in just a few seconds now, the deacons will, the ushers will come forward and we'll give the offering.
So as we finish giving our offering, I want to share a couple of the resources that I found helpful on this subject with you. All of these are just partial treatment, so like they all have a chapter or two on the subject. If you want a whole book on the subject, then you're probably beyond where most of us are on this subject, but there's a lot of great stuff out there. And so if that's what you want to go deeper, some of it you'll find in the footnotes to these. I hope you read footnotes. They're the most interesting part of the whole thing sometimes. But also we've got some people here who are really good at this subject and would be glad to point you to better resources. But really some great on-ramps, I would say, in order of accessibility. One is The Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. We have copies of this in the foyer, and you're welcome to pick up a copy. He's got a chapter on miracles and a chapter on evolution, and so that's pretty good and really accessible. The next one would be this book I've referred to a few times, The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Also some really great chapters on the subject. And then this last one is called For the Glory of God by Rodney Stark, and it is on the subject we're going to take on next week. Basically, this whole book is on the question of hasn't the church done more harm than good? That's the last subject we're going to take up. We're going to take it up next week. Hasn't the church done more harm than good? And this is great. And his chapter on Christianity and science is in here. Now, all these are on the back of your sermon notes. So if you want title and author, they're on the back of those notes, and you can take those and do some of your own reading. So. Well, these are kind of different messages. I know they are. They're a little bit like kind of big thinking and not as much in our Bibles, but they help us in our culture, and that's part of our equipping role. And so I hope they're helpful to you. We're going to wrap it up next week, and then excited to share with you some of the things we're going to be talking about next. Let me dismiss us all with prayer. Father, my prayer for us this morning is that we'll be better equipped to deal with our own questions and our own doubts, our own understanding of you and the world that you made, that we'll be better equipped to represent you well in this valley. And that for those here this morning for whom these are big questions, that this will help move them forward in their consideration of who Jesus is. We pray that you will help us as we go from the church gathered to the church scattered, that we'll represent you well in this valley, because our desire is to reverberate here to the point that someday the knowledge of your glory will fill this valley like the waters fill the sea. That's what we want to see, and that's what we want to be part of. So help us, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thanks. You're dismissed.